What if cutting off your own family wasn't a sign of weakness or selfishness, but actually one of the most psychologically complex decisions a human being can make? Today we're diving deep into the minds of people who have walked away from their families entirely and the science behind why they did it. Because this isn't about drama. This isn't about being difficult. This is about survival, identity, and the painful reality that not every family is a safe place to belong. Let's start with something most people don't want to hear. Family estrangement is far more common than anyone admits. Research suggests that roughly 1 in 4 Americans has cut off contact with a family member at some point in their lives. 1 in 4. That's not a fringe behavior. That's a quietly massive phenomenon happening behind closed doors in neighborhoods everywhere. And yet almost nobody talks about it openly because the social stigma attached to it is absolutely brutal. When someone cuts off a friend, people say good for you. When someone cuts off a family member, people immediately ask, what did you do wrong? That instinctive assumption that the person who walked away must be the problem is one of the cruelest aspects of how we treat family estrangement culturally. And it reveals something important about how deeply we've been conditioned to believe that blood automatically equals safety, love, and belonging. But psychology tells a very different story. Here's a concept you need to understand: enmeshment. It's a term used in family systems therapy to describe relationships where personal boundaries are essentially non-existent. In enmeshed families, individuals aren't really allowed to develop separate identities. Your feelings, your choices, your dreams, they all get swallowed up by the family unit. You're not a person. You're a role, the responsible one, the scapegoat, the golden child. And when someone starts to develop a genuine sense of self that conflicts with that assigned role, the family system often reacts with hostility, guilt, and manipulation. So what does a person do when the very environment that was supposed to nurture them starts crushing them instead? Some people spend decades trying to fix it. They go to therapy, set boundaries, have difficult conversations, and try to make it work. But at a certain point, after enough cycles of hope and disappointment, something shifts in the brain. Psychologists call this a shift in the cost-benefit analysis of the relationship. The emotional cost of maintaining contact starts to dramatically outweigh any benefit the relationship provides. Now here's where it gets really interesting from a neurological standpoint. Chronic exposure to toxic family dynamics doesn't just feel bad. It literally rewires how your brain processes threat and safety. When someone grows up in an environment where a parent is unpredictable, critical, or emotionally unavailable, their nervous system learns to stay on high alert constantly. Years later, even a phone call from that parent can trigger the same stress response as a physical threat. The body keeps score, as psychiatrist Bessel Kolk famously described it. Cutting contact isn't running away from drama. For many people, it's the only way their nervous system ever gets to fully exhale. But let's also talk about the guilt, because that's the part nobody warns you about. People who cut off their families rarely feel liberated right away. What they usually feel first is an overwhelming wave of grief, not relief. Grief. Because what they're mourning isn't just the family they had. They're mourning the family they always wanted and never got. That loss is real, and it's devastating in a very specific way because it's a loss without a funeral, without sympathy cards, without anyone bringing you food. And then on top of that, grief, comes the guilt, often reinforced by extended family, mutual friends, and sometimes their own internal voice asking, shouldn't you just forgive them? Shouldn't family come first? Psychologists who study estrangement note that this guilt is frequently weaponized by the very family members who are causing harm in the first place. Terms like ungrateful and selfish get thrown around to keep people trapped in relationships that are genuinely damaging. There's also a concept called parentification that plays a huge role in many estrangement stories. This is when a child is essentially forced into an emotional caretaking role for one or both parents. The child becomes the therapist, the mediator, the emotional support system, all before they're psychologically equipped to handle that responsibility. Adults who experienced parentification often spend years struggling to understand why they feel responsible for everyone's emotional state but their own. When they finally start prioritizing their own well-being, family members frequently interpret that as a betrayal rather than what it actually is, which is basic self-preservation. Something else worth understanding is how different attachment styles fuel these situations. Psychologist John Bowlby's attachment theory explains that the bonds we form with our earliest caregivers become the template for all future relationships. When those early bonds were characterized by neglect, inconsistency, or emotional abuse, a person might develop what's called an anxious or disorganized attachment style. They crave closeness, but simultaneously fear it. They feel safest when alone, but loneliest in that solitude. Cutting off a family member for someone with this history isn't just a practical decision. It's an act of reclaiming the narrative of their own attachment story. And let's be clear about something. Not everyone who cuts off family is a victim of dramatic abuse. Some estrangements happen slowly, quietly, because of accumulated disappointments, fundamental value differences, or simply an inability to maintain a relationship that feels consistently one-sided. These cases are arguably harder to explain to others, but no less valid. A relationship doesn't have to involve screaming and bruises to be harmful. Emotional unavailability, chronic dismissiveness, and persistent invalidation can cause damage that takes years to unpack in therapy. The people who ultimately go through with estrangement and maintain it tend to share a few psychological characteristics. They've usually done significant self-reflection. They're often in therapy, or have been. They have at least some sense of self-worth that tells them they deserve better, even when the guilt tries to argue otherwise. And they've typically reached a point where the pain of staying became more unbearable than the pain of leaving. Here's the final piece that rarely gets discussed. Estrangement isn't always permanent. Research from Carl Pillemer at Cornell found that many estranged family members do eventually reconnect, sometimes under new conditions, sometimes after circumstances change, sometimes simply because time creates enough distance for genuine healing to begin. But here's what matters most. Whether the estrangement lasts a year or a lifetime, the decision to prioritize your own psychological safety is not something anyone should have to apologize for. The people who cut their families off aren't broken. They're not cold. They're not failures at love. They're often some of the most self-aware, emotionally intelligent people you'll ever meet, precisely because they've done the hardest work any human can do. They've looked directly at something painful, named it honestly, and chosen themselves anyway. And in a world that constantly tells us family is everything, choosing yourself might just be the bravest thing a person can do.